Greetings, respective viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So here I am outside Panmure House, which was Adam Smith's house for the last 12 years of his life. So Panmure House, it takes its name from a Jacobite nobleman who lived here in the early 18th century. Of course, the Jacobite lord had it confiscated after the failure of the Jacobite rebellion in 1745. But on to Adam Smith. So Smith was born in Kirkcaldy, Scotland in 1723. It's called Kirkcaldy, although it's spelled Kirkcaldy. Kirk meaning church in Scots. So he's a posthumous child. He's born 2 months after the death of his father. His father had been an advocate or lawyer, judge, and various other things. So they're quite prosperous, but for an upper middle class family, they were in somewhat straitened circumstances after the death of his father because there were no state pensions or anything in those days. So brought up by his mother. Now, he was very curious in both senses. He may well have been an autistic savant. He would have lengthy and animated conversations with interlocutors who weren't there, imagining he was learning from somebody, inquiring about things or teaching them. He had the most insatiable desire to learn, and he had these poor gross motor skills. He would often forget himself, go walking for miles, not realise he was walking in places. So he was very unusual in his mannerisms, so subject to mockery and derision as a child. And as a schoolboy, wasn't into games at all, rather solitary figure. Sometimes he must have felt melancholy. But So at the age of 14, he went to the University of Glasgow, where he was taught by an Irish academic called Hutcheson. This was the beginnings of the Scottish Enlightenment. So Hutcheson was part of that, despite being from County Down. So obviously the curriculum was classics, was Latin and ancient Greek, but through these languages, they'd be learning philosophy, history, and all sorts. Anyway, he graduated from there, and he won the Snell exhibition to go to Balliol College, Oxford. It's one of the colleges of Oxford University, and has a close relationship with Scotland. It was founded by the father of John Balliol. John Balliol, the Tomb Tabard, briefly King of Scotland. So he went there, and Smith, he was bitterly disappointed at the decrepitude of Oxford University, how it had degenerated into being little more than a finishing school for young aristocrats. Many of the dons cared more about claret and conversation than actually about advancing learning. Because of their huge endowment, they were guaranteed a fat salary, even if they did precious little. They were just sitting there twiddling their thumbs, dining on high table, and some real dolts and laggards were admitted to the university. Anyway, he graduated from there. There's no classification of degrees in there. So he lectured at various universities, including Edinburgh, and including Oxford, tried to raise the standards. Of course, there were scholarly people and there were industrious dons, but you just couldn't guarantee it. In those days, the four Scots universities had a far finer reputation than their two English rivals. So he knew David Hume, who was 12 years older than him. Obviously, Hume was here from Edinburgh, and Smith was in Fife, just a few miles across the Firth of Forth. And Hume helped get him a job as a tutor to the son of the Duke of Buccleuch. Buccleuch is one of the grandest noblemen in Scotland. So with his pupil, whose surname was Scott, with a double T, Adam Smith travelled around France and Switzerland. Of course, he could converse in fluent French like any educated European gentleman at the time. He met Voltaire, the renowned French philosopher, and anyone who was anyone in European letters at the time simply had to meet Voltaire. So Smith spent some time in Paris, and he met Benjamin Franklin, the American revolutionary. Wasn't a revolution at the time, and he socialised a lot with the physiocrats. The physiocrats were this French intellectual movement who were looking into the way things were in France, very unhappy about France's sluggish economic growth, wondered why France, with such a huge area population and so blessed with natural resources, was lagging behind the United Kingdom, which had relatively slender natural resources, minerals and so forth, and yet had healthy economic growth. And gathering all the information they could, they overlapped with the encyclopedists, writing the first encyclopedia, so they knew everything. Well, maybe they could come up with more rational policies for the country. Anyway, so he left there. He lived in Panmure House, as I said, from 1778. He briefly worked as a tax inspector. That's the best way to describe it. So he's known for his theory of moral sentiments, which is partly based on Hume's earlier treatise. Though the two were friends, they weren't that close. And there was a tiny world in the Scots intelligentsia, because the population of Scotland is only about 1.5 million, and the 4 universities between them would produce perhaps 400 graduates at most, and they lived on the same street. Not that Hume graduated, by the way. Anyway, he was brought up in the Church of Scotland, by the way, although he was not particularly religious in relation to the era, and he didn't identify the Whigs or the Tories, wasn't terribly concerned about day-to-day politics. He grappled with the issue of what should be done about the United States or America, the 13 colonies it was in those days, and he said, well, reform has got to be made, and perhaps the United Kingdom should simply grant the colonies independence severally or as a whole lot, the United States, and then the relations would be amicable and no blood would be spilt, and they might enter into a military alliance with the UK in time. Trade links can be preserved, or indeed keep them in the British Empire, grant them representation in Westminster in accordance to their population and wealth, and that will increase and increase, and if their population outstrips that of the United Kingdom, perhaps the capital of the British Empire could be shifted across the Atlantic. Well, it wasn't to be. That last idea was a bit impractical in the days when a voyage across the Atlantic took 6 weeks, even in ideal weather. So anyway, he published his most famous work, his expostulation of capitalism, which was an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. And many people see this as the finest summary of capitalism. They doesn't actually use the word or even talk about economics as such. They used to say political economy generally in those days, saying that people pursue self-interest, that's actually best for the common weal. So you provide the best goods or services you can, because then people want to buy them, and that's good for you, but it's also good for wider society. There was a moral aspect to this as well. Any redistributive policy was not something that he thought ought to be promoted. His views were not quite as straightforward as some of his later acolytes claim. He wasn't a free market fundamentalist. Laissez-faire was very much the attitude of the physiocrats, and he largely endorsed that. They were saying that partly because there were many tariff barriers within France. To move goods from one region of France to another, you had to pay to move them, and they wanted to get rid of that. That was their idea of laissez-faire, or monopolies, or bans on doing this or that. That's what they wanted to get rid of. So he broadly agreed with that. It's not to say he wanted completely unfettered capitalism. He was close to it in his views. He wasn't calling for a welfare state or something like that. So Kirkcaldy, his town, was later represented by Gordon Brown, British Prime Minister of the Labour Party, so a democratic socialist who largely rejected Smith's findings. And Smith's writings were regarded to be gospel until almost a century later when Marx came along and said, well, to hell with all this. It was 1776, curiously enough, when Smith published his Wealth of Nations. So he's buried in the churchyard, which you can't quite see over there behind me. He never married, though he had many friends, and in 1790, when it was blatant that his life was drawing to a close, many people came to pay their respects, James Boswell, for instance, and Smith felt despondent that he had accomplished relatively little. He instructed that his writings that weren't up to the mark be burned, and his executors largely carried out his wishes. So that is Adam Smith, regarded as by many people as the person who wrote the greatest ever expostulation of capitalism and founded economics as a proper subject.